And part of it tied in directly with a world society, a world government. That's why they were given the job and set up to get the workers on board for world governments. And they had international socialism, which is a nice term for international communism. That the leaders of today's Fabian Society still belong to the Internationalist Socialist Party as they're members of the Fabian Society, like Tony Blair, the ex-Prime Minister of Britain, and like Mr. Brown, the present Prime Minister of Britain. Now, they discussed in the 1800s the problems they would face because they had to bring in a multicultural society to destroy the existing nations. That was imperative. Their big boss, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, that was set up, remember, really as the final stage of the creation of two other previous organizations, the Rhodes Foundation, that should be Rhodes and Rothschild Foundation, because Rothschild funded it. That's in their own records, co-founder. And they merged it with the Milner, Lord Milner Society, another branch they'd set up to deal with another parts. And the Milner Group also was made up of all the big banking families and international banking families based in London primarily, although the other ones abroad. And then they set up for non-British Commonwealth countries what they called the Council on Foreign Relations, which was the same as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. They meet together annually and sometimes more than once a year to bring in this wonderful multicultural society. But they also knew that probably towards the end, depending how fast they had to bring in the immigrants, they'd have terrible plans, terrible outcomes, I should say, of massive influxes of vastly different peoples, different cultures. And they'd have to hammer society through laws and threat to make everyone just accept everyone else and accept the way it is, or was going to be. If you go back into the writings and try and get the books out there, for those who don't have them, put out by the Rockefeller Foundation on behalf, you see, he did the funding for all the books for the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Try to get a hold of their annual meetings, because they publish them every year. And you'll find every major politician from every country they have ever heard of attends. Generally, those in charge of their treasury departments attend this non-governmental organization. This non-governmental organization that has the biggest think tanks on the planet working on crucial elements of the upcoming society which they're guiding into being. And you'll find they have members always within the current party in power, and they have members within the current bureaucracies in federal and state organizations. And they also have many ex-politicians and high-level bureaucrats and prime ministers and presidents working. And what Professor Carroll Quigley, who was the historian for this group, called it the parallel government. And Quigley was all for this big agenda. Now, you go into, again, it's one part of it, the Fabian Society, to get the working class on board. And you find that the founders have a stained glass window set up in the house, the big building that was initially their place. And you can find that on the internet, where you find likenesses of the founders at the founding meeting hammering the world, the whole world, on an anvil, like blacksmiths would hammer metal into shape. And that's what it symbolizes, hammering the world into shape. And they said that the nation state would have to go from the very beginning. Internationalism only. And they planned 3 main trading blocks, by the way. 3 main trading blocks. The same ones, of course, that Karl Marx wrote about in the 1800s as well. See, these guys all knew each other very, very well. And they set up organizations to bring in a United Americas. That was the job of the Council on Foreign Relations, and another specialized branch called the Trilateral Commission. For the Pacific areas, including Australia and New Zealand, China, Japan, and others, they set up the Institute for Pacific Studies, they called it, a front group for the same organization. And going through some of that and the fallout of it all as we get hammered into shape after this break. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt. We're cutting through the matrix. Just as always, giving a little background to something before I just read it off. Because if you don't understand the background of the whys of things, you won't really understand what's happening today. And I was going through some of the Fabian Society, Royal Institute of International Affairs, the really powerful organizations that set up specialized branches to make the preparatory stages for three world conglomerates, you might say, of blocks of countries. And they spent 100 years at that. 100 years to set it up. And literally they went into geopolitics with their members in power in every generation, getting the wars going, getting things going, so that they could eventually amalgamate everything together at the end. And they discussed how they'd bring in excessive multiculturalism. You see, when immigrants come into a country, they generally come in and they drift in bits and pieces, and they amalgamate into the culture of the country. That was also the big lie they put out about the European Union. They said, and these guys were behind that, they drafted it up, in fact, the same organization, and they said that you'll keep your sovereignty, your culture and your way of life, and your sovereignty too. And they lied and lied and lied for about 30, 40 years about that. And now we see this monster up at the top, and it's run in secrecy at the top. And really it's as well as getting run from Mars. It's so remote from all the countries it lords over, this Tower of Babel. And here's one of the articles that's come out, probably on cue at the right time. Because they do love to admit sometimes how they've done things, and it's almost like a slap in the face to the public, like, didn't you notice? And I've mentioned before that the guys that they pick to go into the top as prime ministers or presidents are chosen years and years and years before the public ever hears of them. They're vetted and trained for the little role they'll have. They're guaranteed, in fact, I'm sure, probably 15, 20 years before we ever hear their names, that they will be made president or prime minister. And here's what they're going to do when you get in, that far back, because we're living a script. A well-written, rehearsed script. They've gone over every possible backlash and how to deal with it. That's how things are done in the military. If we did do this, the enemy will do that. How will we overcome that? This is all done on the drawing board, over and over and over again, so that they can always counter opposition. This article came from the Mail Online on October the 25th. It's from, the Mail in Britain. Now, Britain is the flagship for us all to follow. Whatever happens there, believe you me, is happening elsewhere at the same time. Other countries, like Canada, are much more quiet about it. It's almost more arrogant, I should say, because we're really a colony, you see, of London. A colony. And the colonial leaders really lorded over the public with a form of disdain, a snobbish disdain, and they hated telling the public anything at all. Well, they still do in the Commonwealth countries.